Okay, this is gonna be a pretty short podcast. I want to talk about something that's important um, when thinking about Spanish Texas. At the last part of the class last week, I talked about, or on Tuesday, I talked about how the after 1763, Louisiana became a possession of Spain. And that was very significant for Texas because the Spanish government is always looking for a way to cut costs in Texas. And once Louisiana becomes Spanish, the Texas becomes not that significant to Spain. As I just talked about in the previous podcast, it's gained a new significance in the sense that there is a little bit of an income dribbling in from the cattle and cattle the roundup of cattle and cattle drives, but at the same time, the Spanish government's not getting the money that it should out of this because smuggling is so rampant, especially smuggling of cattle and horses into Louisiana. But the upshot is that you have this thing called the new regulations. The Spanish government is rethinking its role in Texas. A lot of very important governmental decisions come out of this. One of these is the decision of the Spanish to make peace with the Comanche, to basically buy off the Comanche by giving them gifts. And that comes out of a treaty that's signed in 1785, which I talked about in a previous podcast. And one of the bonuses of this um, uh, treaty, the 1785 treaty between the Comanche and the Spanish, is that they team up and they nearly annihilate the Apache. And the Apache become much less of a problem to San Antonio than they had been before. Um, One of the things that you'll see in a quiz or a midterm, and you should make note of it, the Comanche were a problem for San Antonio. But basically, the Comanche were kind of west of San Antonio, north of San Antonio for the most part. The Indian group that really caused the biggest headaches in San Antonio by far were the Lapon Apache, who had been pushed down into the San Antonio area by the Comanche. So it was the Apache who were really causing problems in San Antonio. And what the Apache are doing is there's all these ranches that I've been talking about in the previous podcast. Well, for the Apache, that is just fantastic. And so what you have is massive theft of horses and cattle during this period of Texas history, where the Apache are just constantly stealing cattle and horses from the ranching areas around San Antonio. And it's not like they're, they're more interested, rather than in killing the Spanish, they're much more interested in just stealing from the Spanish cattle, but and especially horses. The horses are really key here because horses are so important to the mobility of the Apache. So, so the Apache are a big problem, but after the 1780s, because of this peace treaty with the Comanche, who hate the Apache, the Apache, for a time being anyway, are become much less of a problem for San Antonio. Now, by the way, the Comanche will become a problem for the San Antonio later on, but for now, it, let's say between the 1780s and the early 1800s, things are pretty quiet in San Antonio, which was rare. Usually, uh, it was quite dangerous in San Antonio, constant theft, disease. It was not a place that many people would want to live. Okay, so big picture. The Spanish government is consolidating. It's trying to cut its expenses in Texas. And as part of this new regulations, there's peace treaty with the Comanche. The Comanche and the Spanish go after the Lapon Apache. Another important feature of this is the secularization of the missions. Basically, the Spanish government pulls out of the business of supporting the missions. Remember, the Mission Presidio system was the game plan that the Spanish government had come up with in order to populate Texas and also California, New Mexico, and Arizona. And in Texas, it worked in two places. It worked in San Antonio and it worked in Goliad. But the Mission Presidio system, the missions were always designed to go out of business. And this is a really important point to remember about the Mission Presidio system. They were designed to go out of business. And by the 1780s, the Spanish government wants to pull out the Franciscans, and they just want to hand the missions over to the Catholic Church. They want to stop supporting the missions. They've supported the missions for about 60 years now, and they just want to get out. They want to save money. And so they begin secularizing the missions, and what that means is that they just pull government support from the missions. Now, the Spanish don't know that they're going to be kicked out of North America in 1821, and there's actually going to be a revolution against Spain beginning in 1811. They're thinking that they're going to hold on to Texas forever. But by the 1780s, 1790s, let's just take it to 1800. Here's how the Spanish see Texas. There's three communities that are working in Texas. There's Nacogdoches, which had just been established or reestablished after those East Texans had been kicked out of East Texas, then appealed, and then were allowed to return. So Nacogdoches. Goliad, which of course had been created by Aguayo in the 1720s. It's probably the most successful ranching area of Spanish Texas. And most of all, San Antonio, which is by far the most important community in Spanish Texas. So the three cities that the Spanish created that are still with us today, San Antonio, Goliad, Nacogdoches. Okay, so, but when the Spanish look at Texas, they just are not super happy about what they see. The one industry in Texas, cattle ranching, which is really successful, the Spanish government's not getting the money out of it that they wanted because there's so much smuggling of cattle into Louisiana. So the Spanish government feels like that is a net loss for them. They've made peace with the Comanche, but the Comanche are still quite strong. And although they're not going to war with them constantly, the Spanish militarily don't have a firm control over Texas. And from the Spanish point of view, Texas is just a major headache. A major headache. And one Spanish official described Texas as a howling wilderness that only had 3 communities. And again, as I've said many, many times, the Spanish just have not been able to populate Texas. So by 1800, where the next podcast is going to pick up, the Spanish are consolidating in Texas. They're cutting costs in Texas by taking away government support of the missions. And by the way, the missions, the Catholic Church doesn't really have the money to take care of the missions. And by the time of the Texas Revolution, many of these missions are ruins. The Valero, San Antonio de Valero, or the Valero mission, which became the Alamo, people are storing cattle there and hay. Folks are coming and taking the bricks from the mission or the stone from the mission to build fences for their ranches. So by the 1830s, the missions are basically ruins. They've only been rebuilt in the 20th century. They were rebuilt in the 1930s. So San Antonio is, as you'll see at the beginning of the Tourget book, is not really doing that well. Spanish Texas as a whole is not really that successful. And worse things are about to happen from the point of view of the Spanish. First of all, in 1803, the United States purchases Louisiana, and Spanish Texas gets a new and far more powerful enemy, infinitely more powerful and dangerous than the French. And on top of that, beginning in what's now central Mexico in 1810, there's a revolution against Spain. So things are not great in Spanish Texas by 1800, but they're about to get much worse.